Hello everyone, welcome back to Foot Forecast. In today's video, I'm going to go through my ranking for every Premier League side's transfer window. So I'm going to go back and judge which side actually had the best transfer window. So let's start off with the first side, and it is Arsenal. And a lot of people would assume, okay, Premier League champions, Arsenal must have had the best transfer window, or one of the best out of everyone. But I look at this transfer window, and it wasn't actually that good considering they spent almost 300 million euros. You look at the players they brought in, and I think Zubimendi has been good. I think Mosquera has been a decent squad option, and Hincapié has been a good left back for Arsenal this season. But then I look at some of the other signings, they haven't really paid off yet. You look at Eze. I think Eze's been alright. I think Gyökeres has been alright, but I'm not convinced that's a great signing for the future, as I think Arsenal are going to look to replace him this summer because I think they need someone better. Then you look at Noni Madueke, just an alright squad player. And then you've got Christian Norgard, who's barely played, and Kepa, who made a major mistake in the cup final. If I had to rank this Arsenal transfer window, I'd say a couple of signings have come off and a couple of signings have definitely failed. So I think for Arsenal, I'm going to go with a C transfer window. I think that's fair for them. Please let me know if you disagree on that, because obviously they are Premier League champions, but I think I have been fair on that. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter because they have won the Premier League. Who cares how good your transfer window really was? So let's actually put Arsenal into the C category. Then I'm on to Aston Villa, and I actually think this is one of the worst transfer windows which are on this list, and I'll tell you why. Because if you go through these transfers, I reckon there's only been one, I would say, good signing, and that was Victor Lindelof on a free. Look at some of the other deals that have been brought in. Gesson has been a crap. Tammy Abraham been very average. This Brazilian guy they brought in from Grêmio's barely played. Ozcan's barely played. Douglas Luiz, no real impact. Bizot, just a backup keeper. Jadon Sancho and Harvey Elliott on loan haven't really worked out. Sancho's been alright. Leon Bailey, recalling him, he hasn't really worked out as a transfer. So if you look at that, Villa really haven't brought any great signings, which I just think shows the great job that Unai Emery did winning the Europa League despite having a poor transfer window and finishing in the top four. I'm going to put Villa into E. I think it's crap, and I don't see any sort of transfers being great players in the future. That random Brazilian winger they brought in may be good, but apart from that, I can't really see many good deals that they've really brought in. Then I'm on to Bournemouth, and I think with a club like Bournemouth, you've got to look at the sales they made. They made over 300 million euros in sales, selling Semenyo, Zabaini, Huijsen, Kerkez, Otara, Jadon Anthony, Billing. All these sales have contributed to that. So straight away, I think automatically it has to be a decent window for Bournemouth, making that much money. But at the same time, you've also got to reinvest that in bringing good players, which they have done, signing Ryan and Trufi, and I think Petrovic has been a decent signing. Diakite has been alright, but then Senesi and James Hill have been better. I think for Bournemouth, I'm going to go with quite a high B for them because they made a huge amount of sales and they brought in a couple of really talented players, which they're going to sell on for a lot in the future. They also brought in Krupi Jr. for a very reasonable fee, but I don't think it's on this list because it was from a sister club. Then I'm on to Brentford, and once again with Brentford, you've got to look at the sales that they've made. They've made over 150 million euros in sales, selling Brian Mbeumo, Johan Wissa, Christian Norgard and Mark Flecken. And with that money, they've also brought in some very good players, bringing in Coyote for a very reasonable fee of 17 million euros, bringing in Queven Callagher, bringing in Otara, who I thought was a very expensive deal, but he's turned out to be a very good player for Brentford, and bringing in Jordan Henderson on a free. It's a very good business from Brentford. You could make an argument for A, but I'm going to go with a B for Brentford. I think Bournemouth and Brentford have had two very good windows, considering the sales that they have made and then how they've reinvested that money. Then we're on to Brighton, and once again Brighton's another side that have made some great sales in the last couple of transfer windows. They've generated over 140 million euros, but I think the difference between Brighton and Bournemouth and Brentford is the fact they actually haven't brought in too many good players. If you look at this list, I'm not actually convinced any of those players have been outstanding. I mean, probably the best deal they brought in was probably Pascal Gross for 2 million euros, and then De Cooper's been decent. But apart from that, I don't think Brighton have made a huge number of great deals. So for that reason, for Brighton, I'm just going to go with C, which is more due to the sales that they have made. Then I'm on to Burnley. Now, despite going down, I don't think Burnley actually had the worst transfer window because they actually brought in quite a few good players. Ugochukwu been alright, Fleming's been good, and Jayden Anthony's been good. Dubravka's been solid in goal. But I think they needed more of these type of signings. And they also brought in some crap players like Broja for 23 million euros, which was definitely too much. And as well as this, they didn't invest in January, which was sort of unacceptable because it basically confirmed relegation for Burnley. I think for Burnley, I'm going to go with a D+. If they just made one or two more good purchases, I think I would have pushed them into C because I don't think it was a terrible window from Burnley. So I'm on to Chelsea, and if you look at Chelsea, the sales from Chelsea are good, generating over 300 million euros in sales. For clubs like Chelsea, I think sales are less relevant to talk about compared to clubs like Brentford, Brighton, and Bournemouth, because Chelsea don't need to bring in all these sales to be able to spend because they're in current competitions like the Champions League and because they have rich owners. But anyway, that is still a positive for Chelsea, bringing that much in the sales. In terms of their incomings, they've made some good signings, bringing in Pedro and Esteval, and those are two players that I think are going to be good for them in the future, and Joel Hato, who's been alright. But then they've made some crap signings, signing the likes of Garnacho, Gittins, and Delap, which just aren't good enough for Chelsea. And I don't see them being important players in the future. They also failed to get a keeper and a centre-half, which isn't acceptable. I think for Chelsea, I'm going to put them into the D tier. So I'm on to Crystal Palace, and honestly, it hasn't been a great couple of transfer windows that they've had recently, despite doing well on the pitch, winning the Conference League, because you look at the sales they've made. First of all, they sold Eze for around £60 million, which is a good sale. But then they sold Gahey for £20 million, and they probably got about £30 to £40 million under what they should have got for him, but his contract was set to expire. And overall, that has been a mess for Crystal Palace, and so far they've struggled to replace Mark Gahey. Looking at the incomings for Palace, it isn't great. They bought Strand Larsen and Brennan Johnson for a combined 90 million euros. Those two players combined are probably worth 50 to 60 million euros at most. They have made a decent signing in Convot, who looks like a good player for the future, and Yeremy Pino's been decent. But overall, I don't think it's been a great couple of transfer windows from Palace, and they really haven't got their money's worth so far. I'm going to put Palace into a D-. I've been overall disappointed with them. They need to be better in the summer. And I'm a bit worried that their transfers aren't really going to improve because Dougie Freeman has left the club, who was so important for Crystal Palace. And so far, it looks like they've struggled to replace him with two poor transfer windows in a row. What's also worth noting about Palace, actually, is that they also failed to get the depth for Glasner in the first half of this season, which resulted in some poor form during the Christmas period. So that's something else to note about the Palace transfer window, is that they struggled to get sufficient depth that was required with them being in Europe and trying to compete in all the cups. Then I'm on to the next side, and it is Everton. I was really excited by Everton's transfer window in the summer, but overall, I actually don't think it's been that good. I think so far, Grealish and Dewsbury Hall have been two very good signings. But they've also made some poor signings with the likes of Dibbling and Barry. Alcaraz has been an alright signing for Everton. But my main concern with a side like Everton is that they didn't really address the major problem, which was the striker. They tried to with Barry, but so far he hasn't been good enough and his attitude stinks. And then the other position, which I felt was so important for Everton, was the fullbacks, but they failed to address this, which resulted in Everton struggling at points this season. And for that reason, I think I'm going to go with a D+ for Everton's transfer window. You could make an argument for a C, considering Grealish has been a decent signing despite picking up the injury, and Dewsbury Hall's been very good. But I think they failed to address some key positions, which has cost them this season. Then I'm on to Fulham, and when I look at the last couple of transfer windows that they have had, I just see a lack of ambition. They've really only brought in 3 players that could challenge for starting positions: Kevin, Oscar Bob, and Chukwueze. And when you're doing this, you're never really going to progress as a club, and you're just going to stay a mid-table side. For this reason, I'm going to go with a D for Fulham. Overall, I've been disappointed with them. And I'm a bit worried about Fulham if they lose Marco Silva, because another manager may fail to get the best out of this side without proper investment. Then I'm on to Leeds United. This is definitely one of the better transfer windows that you will see, especially from a newly promoted side. If you look at the players that Leeds brought in, they brought in Stack, Visual, Goodmanson, Calvert-Lewin, Justin and Okafor all in for under 115 million euros. Those are some great deals from Leeds United, bringing in Calvert-Lewin on a free, bringing in Stack for only 20 million euros. And for this reason, I'm going to put Leeds into A. That transfer window ensured that Leeds stayed up in the Premier League this season. And if Leeds failed to bring in this quality, they would have definitely been more in a relegation scrap and would have most likely gone down. So huge credit to the Leeds recruitment team. What you could say about Leeds is maybe they should have invested more in January, but I'm not going to hold that against them because they didn't need to, as we saw by the fact that they stayed in the division. Then I'm on to Liverpool, and I think at the time a lot of people were looking at this window as one of the best because it really did look good, but it hasn't really worked out at all for them, and they failed to buy a centre-half, which ended up being a massive mistake for Liverpool because Konate has struggled for a lot of this season. They could have used a quality centre-half like Mark Gahey, who they were trying to sign on deadline day. And overall, Liverpool spent over 450 million euros, and most signings so far haven't worked out. You look at the list, Isak so far has been a complete failure. Same with Wirtz. Ekitike's been good, but Kirkes hasn't worked out. Frimpong hasn't worked out. Leone's had an injury for most of the season. So overall from Liverpool, it's been poor, and I think I've got to put them into the E tier. The only good thing for Liverpool is in the future is I think this transfer window will work out now they've appointed a new manager in Andoni Iraola, but those signings really have to step up next season. I think what is worth noting for Liverpool is that they did generate over 200 million euros in sales, but I still don't think that justifies being in the D tier because they spent that 200 million euros in sales on players like Isak, Wirtz, Kirkes and Frimpong. Then I'm on to Manchester City, and I actually think overall City had a really good couple of transfer windows, and the reason why is because you look at these incomings. They brought in Antoine Semenyo, who's been so far a success. They brought in Reinders, who has struggled, and Ait-Nouri, who's been alright. But then they brought in Ryan Cherki for 36 million euros, an absolute bargain. James Trafford, who's been a decent backup for City, but it has sort of been a bit of a waste of money on a backup keeper. They brought in Donnarumma for 30 million euros and then Gahey for 23 million euros. I look at that and I think they've made 4 standout signings, have City, of Semenyo, Cherki, Donnarumma and Gahey. And they've also generated 100 million euros in sales, which is a bonus, but that's sort of what you expect from a side like City. And as I've already said, I'm not really taking that into account for the bigger sides. I'm going to give this City window an A. I think if you bring in 4 players that are basically good enough to start for Manchester City in 2 transfer windows, and they've proven their quality this season, then I think it's probably an A window. And I think this window got City very close to Arsenal in the title race. And without it, City would have been nowhere near Arsenal. Maybe you could go with the argument of City's transfer windows actually cost them the league because they didn't bring enough quality. But I'm going to go with the opposite narrative because I think it's correct. I think City's transfer window brought them a lot closer to Arsenal. Then I'm on to Manchester United, and United made 4 signings, and I think you could argue all 4 of those signings so far have worked out. Some people may disagree with Sesko, but I think he's been decent so far, and I think the other 3 signings of Mbeumo, Cunha and Lemans have been outstanding so far. As well as this, they've actually made a decent amount in sales, and for this reason, I'm going to put Manchester United's transfer window into A. I think it's been brilliant, really. No signings really flopped, and 3 of the signings, I would argue, are probably in the top 20 signings of the season. So overall, I think United have actually had a very good couple of windows. What I would say is maybe United could have invested a bit more in January, but it didn't really matter because they went on to qualify for the Champions League either way, and now they've got a lot more to spend in the summer. Then I'm on to Newcastle United, and it's been a couple of terrible windows and chaotic windows for Newcastle. Maybe you could argue it's been a decent window because they sold Isak for a record fee, but I look at the players that they replaced Isak with, and that's where the problems start to occur. because they spent the Isak money on Wissa and Voltemade. And look, Voltemade I think has been alright, but Wissa has been one of the worst signings of the season. As well as this, they brought Anthony Elanga, who's been rubbish so far. I don't think Jacob Ramsey is going to be a huge difference maker for them in the future as a signing. I just think he's a decent Premier League player, but Newcastle need better than that, especially when you're spending 45 million euros on that player. Chow's been pretty good. That's probably been their best signing for 35 million euros, and then Ramsdale's barely played on loan. Overall, I think it's probably got to be an transfer window for Newcastle. They made a couple of alright signings in Chow and Voltemade, but they've made a lot more poor signings. And my main concern is I don't see many of those signings working out in the future. The only two are probably Chow and Voltemade. I don't think Ramsey's going to be anything too special. I wouldn't be surprised if Visa and Elanga are sold in the summer. And I'm not even sure if Ramsdale will be a permanent deal for Newcastle next season. I'm not even sure if I'd make it a permanent deal because I just think he's an alright Premier League keeper. Then I'm on to Nottingham Forest, and overall it's been a poor couple of windows for Forest. I think only a couple of signings have actually been alright, which isn't good enough when you've spent 230 million euros. I think the only signings that have been reasonably good so far is probably Jarkonya, who's actually been quite good in fairness. And maybe you could say Amari Hutchinson, but he was brought in for a big fee of 43 million euros, and so far I don't think he's really repaid that. And a lot of their deals so far haven't really worked out at all. Kalamundu's gone out on loan. Bakua hasn't really impacted the side so far. Dan Ndoye's been crap. James McAtee hasn't broken into the side at all, really. Igor Jesus has maybe been alright at fine. John Victor has made a couple of poor errors in goal for Forest. I wouldn't be surprised if he's sold in the summer. And look, maybe you could justify some of these poor signings by saying they made some good sales, which they did. But similar to Newcastle, it doesn't save the window, because how they spent the money was so poor, which they made from those departures. And for that reason, I'm going to put Forest into E. Then I'm on to the next side, and it is Sunderland, and this has to be one of the standout transfer windows. In fact, I would say it is the standout transfer window out of everyone. You look at some of the incomings they've made, and it's outrageous, really. Bringing in Roos for 10 million euros, bringing in Alderete for 10 million euros, bringing in Mukiele for 12 million euros, bringing Xhaka in for 15 million euros, bringing in Siddiqui for 17 million euros, and then bringing in Brobbey for 20 million euros, and Enzo Lafay for £20 million. There have been a couple of deals that haven't really worked out so far, the likes of Diarra, Adingra, and Angulo, who was brought in January. But overall, it's still the best transfer window out of anybody, and they brought the best signing in the summer, and that was Granit Xhaka for 15 million euros. On top of this, they also made some great sales for a side coming in to the Premier League, selling Joe Bellingham and Tommy Watson. Then I'm on to Spurs, and this is quite a difficult one, I think, to judge, because if you actually look at the incomings, they've actually made some decent signings. I think Simmons has been alright at points, and I think he's a player that will work out in the future. I think Kudus was good before he picked up that injury. Gallagher was good for the last 5 games, but I'm still not convinced by that signing. Denso, I think, has been alright at points. I think Vuskovic will be a great signing in the future. Polini has been alright. But my problem with the Spurs is more how they handled the January transfer window, because Spurs really needed to bring a couple of players in January to basically, first of all, ensure that they weren't in a relegation battle, which they ended up being in. But second of all, to allow Spurs to actually have a good season. What they needed was an option out wide and a progressive midfielder. Instead, they signed players like Gallagher and Souza, where they really needed difference makers, which they failed to buy after selling Brennan Johnson for 40 million euros. And for this reason, I'm going to put Spurs into a low D. If they got relegated, I think this transfer window would have had to be an E, because I would have said that their January window literally cost them Premier League safety. But I've given them a D because they've stayed up and they've actually made some decent signings. And I think the signings that will work out in the future, the likes of Kudus, Vuskovic, Xavi Simmons. I think Gallagher might be an alright squad player in the future. So overall, I don't think it's actually been horrendous from Spurs. And I'd probably say their actual summer window was actually alright, like a C minus, maybe a D. But it was the January window which really cost them. That for me is like an E window, an E minus. It was that bad because they only brought in Gallagher and Souza, and that's why they've ended up in probably, I would say, a low D. Then on to the next club, and it is West Ham, and this is actually quite similar to Spurs. West Ham actually brought in some good players like Mateus Fernandes. Todibo's been decent at points. Castellanos has been good overall. You look at Axel Disasi, he's been good in January. Kyle Walker-Peters has been a decent signing. Callum Wilson's been a good signing for them and a decent player to bring off the bench. But it's more about the timing in terms of these transfers. West Ham were absolutely desperate for a striker in the summer transfer window, but instead they got Fulkrug and Wilson, where they really needed a player like Castellanos, which they ended up getting in January. West Ham were desperate for a centre-half, but they ended up getting Igor Julio on loan, where what they needed was a player like Disasi, who they didn't get to January. So the actual players they brought in weren't bad. It was more about the fact that they were bringing in these players in January instead of the summer, which basically cost West Ham their Premier League safety. And for that reason, I can't give the transfer window any higher than a D, despite actually bringing in a couple of decent players. At the same time, though, West Ham did bring in a couple of poor players, the likes of Pablo. Juve hasn't turned out to be a great signing. He's not good enough defensively, despite Juve looking like a player that could play in the Premier League in terms of athleticism and his ability going forward. Mads Hermansen hasn't been a great signing at all. Magassa hasn't really made a huge impact on the side. Adama Traore was a waste of money. So I think overall, in terms of the transfers, I think West Ham's probably like a C. But in terms of the timings of the transfers, in terms of bringing Castellanos too late on, and same with Disasi, it's dropped it down to probably a D minus, because overall you could argue it actually has cost West Ham Premier League safety. Then I'm on to Wolves, and it's just got to be an E-transfer window for Wolves straight away. I think they've probably made one good signing across the two transfer windows, and that was Krejci, but that's literally it. Krejci's been good, but apart from that, they've literally had no good transfers in, and that has cost Wolves Premier League safety. It's that simple. And then in January, it was more about recouping whatever they could for their players so they could prepare for the Championship, which I think is the right thing for Wolves to do, because they had no chance of surviving and they were better off cashing in and building a really good Championship side, which they've already started doing with the signing of Adam Armstrong in January, and we've already seen Wolves start to do that this summer with the signing of Kieran Trippier, which looks like a great signing for Wolves, and extending Andre's contract. But despite this and the sales, it's still an E window for Wolves. It's that simple. It did cost them their Premier League safety, that's for sure. For West Ham, it's a bit different because at least they brought in some good players that could have potentially kept them up, with the likes of Mateus Fernandes, with the likes of Disasi in January and Castellanos. Wolves literally brought in no one apart from Krejci that was actually probably ready to play in the Premier League. So that is the end of this video. Please let me know your thoughts on this ranking. Where do you agree? Where do you disagree? I really want to hear your thoughts down below. And if you enjoyed this video, it'd be great if you could subscribe to this channel as well as liking the video.